Hey, I'm Jay, and let's talk about maybe one of the most important things to think about in sculpting. We're going to talk about theory and a mode of thinking that you should be using on everything that you make. All right, so let's jump into it. Okay, so in today's video, it's not necessarily a step-by-step tutorial. We'll make those videos too, but I wanted to make this video because this is probably one of the most important and fundamental theories of sculpting and really making art. Not everybody knows it, and if you do know about this, stay tuned because I think there's still some nuggets in here probably that you're not fully aware of, but this is an important theory and mode of thinking that's going to help sculpting. We're going to talk about sculpting today, and I'm going to relate it back to ZBrush a little bit because that's what I do all the time and that's what we talk about on the channel. But honestly, you can use this to break down anything complicated into something that's more manageable. Okay, so let's jump in. What we're talking about today is form hierarchy. Okay, maybe not as exciting as you were hoping for, but definitely stick with me here because this is a super key concept that you can use in everything. So the three key words today that we're going to talk about a lot in this video are primary, secondary, and tertiary forms. Now, this is kind of the classical terminology, and you can see here that essentially it just means 1, 2, and 3, okay? And so these are going to be categories that we're going to talk about and discuss, but you can think of these as sort of buckets, all right, to put aspects of the form of something complicated into. We're going to talk a little bit about, you know, the unique aspects, but really, to put it simple, primary, the first one, most important, is going to be the structure. Secondary breaks it down. Tertiary breaks that down even more, okay? So it's just a way to pick anything complicated and then separate it into these three categories so you can think about it, we can discuss it, and you can work on it individually, all right? So let's put these at the top here and we'll start breaking down some aspects that are unique to each of these terms and categories. Okay, so primary forms, simplest forms. These are almost primitives. They're not, but they don't have too much contrast in them. The metaphor I like to use when trying to describe it is as if you covered your sculpture in saran wrap or something. You know, you shrink wrapped it. That's the primary forms, okay? Fewest. There aren't that many of these. Again, it's going to be smooth. It's the big general foundation, as if you melted it. And really the essence, the most efficient form, largest and most important. It's really important as we get into it here and as you start thinking about it to realize that each of these categories works on top of the foundation of the previous. So even though every aspect is important for certain reasons, primary forms are the most important thing. And I emphasize that because it's very common to overlook it. You know, it's boring. It can be technical. It's almost like layout, you know. Secondary, more fun, getting to do sculpting, pushing and pulling. And then tertiary, obviously, adding like crispy little details is fun. But you can't overlook primary forms here. And that's what you want to be working on too as you're practicing. So important that it's known as the most important thing. Everything follows this. So the stronger your primary forms are, then the stronger your work's going to be as you move to secondary forms. And then lastly, tertiary forms. Art obviously is a lot more chaotic. It's not exactly linear all the time, but you can think of this also as 1, 2, 3 in terms of the steps. First thing you're doing when you're sculpting is you're establishing primary forms. Once those are established, now you're making secondary forms, which is breaking up primary forms into smaller, more complex ones. So primary forms, just to put a button on it, it's the pose too. It's the proportion. It's the first part of likeness. If primary forms are off of a likeness and you get secondary and tertiary on point, doesn't matter. You already broke likeness. Whereas if you have tertiary forms that aren't even the same as your model, doesn't matter. People honestly, actually in real life in production, will use like photo scans of a 30-year-old woman and put it on an alien or an old man. Tertiary forms are very like, you know, it's not as important. But primary forms, if you want to get likeness, you have to make sure that they're on point, okay? Secondary forms, more complicated. Definitely more complicated than primary forms. We're starting to get more contrast in the shapes. You know, it's got more going on, more organic, you might say, another way of saying it. We're starting to get more thick and thin, and they're getting smaller. This is more time consuming. This is probably the most time consuming step, that you'll spend a lot of time on. Primary forms, you want to be meticulous. You're setting everything up. But secondary forms is where you're starting to really flush things out. And there's a lot more of them, obviously. And as I said, tertiary forms are kind of trivial in that they're not as important to being accurate. But secondary forms are important, and they can be, challenging and time consuming to get right. So you'll spend a lot of your time in a sculpt in this phase here. And secondary forms are emotive. Important to realize that now that you have primary forms, which is like the solid foundation, right? The proportions, the likeness, the pose. And now once you're doing secondary forms, that's where you're starting to get not only the definition in features, but maybe skin is starting to bunch, on the muscles as they're turning. Maybe the face is starting to scrunch. We're starting to see the eyelids move. We're starting to see eyebrows move. Okay, so secondary forms, also, some trivial things like veins or wrinkles you might think of, but it's also the most emotive part. And then tertiary is going to just follow suit and emphasize what's going on the surface. But secondary forms are the emotive forms. All right, lastly, tertiary forms, the most complex. You can see as we're moving down the line, it's getting more complicated. So now tertiary forms are the most complex and the most numerous. If you compare the primary form of a head, which is relatively simple, it's large, not a lot going on. Tertiary forms, now we're talking about things like skin pores, wrinkles, details. Now there's like a lot of them, and they're very irregular, and they're just all over. And, so you can see the contrasting in just those different buckets and how we're separating those kinds of forms, right? And details. And they're obviously the smallest. So you can see working down the line here, it's getting more complicated, it's getting more numerous, and it's getting smaller. Again, each category is breaking up the previous category. So we're going big to small. And tertiary, arguably least important. We're going to look at some examples here in a second, and it depends on what you're doing. It can be done very quickly nowadays. It depends on which method you want to do. You can do it in a painstaking way, and you can do it fast. There are lots of assets out there nowadays to facilitate adding tertiary forms because of production requirements. You can even buy assets like I even have my own skin detailing brushes, obviously, that you can get and use if you want. And you can go to things like Texture XYZ to buy maps already done and put on. So you can get something very photorealistic by using photogrammetry nowadays and get tertiary detail on any sculpt, in a matter of minutes. And then this is important in realism. Tertiary, I would argue, again, not as important. And this is subjective. Is it important in a great work of art? Not necessarily. Depends on what you're doing. But if you're trying to do realism, then we're not just talking about sculpture here. If you even look at a Pixar movie, which is doing realism in terms of materials and lighting, you'll notice these tiny realistic little details in things. So realism as a goal, as a category, and as a style of work, tertiary details are obviously extremely crucial in that. Okay, so this is my big breakdown, and now let's jump in. I made a couple of demos for you to show you a sculpt, and I just kind of worked on something. So obviously, we're just going to look at some of my work because that's what I have on me. Before we move on, really quickly, I want to thank this video sponsor, Skillshare. The first 1,000 people to click the link down below in the description get a 1-month free trial. So I'm still running through Skillshare. Obviously, it's got so many different videos on all these kinds of topics. If you're interested in things like photography and videography, like I said, I'm interested in making videos, YouTube videos like the one I'm doing right now. So there's a couple on my queue right here. There's storytelling through film. And then Ali, it's another guy that I subscribe to on YouTube, and he's talking about video editing in Final Cut Pro and also how to become a cool ass YouTuber doing that. And that's what I want to be. I edit in Final Cut Pro, so maybe I can learn some things from this guy because he's obviously awesome. So Skillshare's got a lot of things that appeal to me. I assume it's got things that appeal to you. So if you haven't done it already, check out Skillshare. I've got that free trial that you can take a look at and learn some stuff right now. Why not? For free. Okay, so we're moving over here to my sculpts, and we're just going to use this as an example. So I have two somewhat recent sculpts that I've done, and then I did a little mock-up demo here to kind of visualize these hierarchies, these kinds of form categories so that we can better look at it and talk about it, okay? So here I have this hand sculpt and this face sculpt that I did somewhat recently that we can take a look at. And I've got the models here loaded in ZBrush. So let's take a look at this as a primary form. Okay, so this would be the first thing. Now, I want to say before going on, I did some work here to visualize these. Now, this is something that I'm thinking about as I'm working and when I try to break down other work. But does that mean that I'm like rigidly making primary forms before secondary? No, but I created these 3 separate models so we can visualize how to separate these kinds of forms, okay? So here we have the primary form of the hand. Now you can see it's pretty simple, right? It feels very doable. It should, hopefully. And if it does, great. And if not, this should be the first thing you're trying to figure out how to do, making primary forms of stuff. So still, you can see we have the pose. We have things like this angle, you know, of the thumb. We still have some personality here. You can kind of see the joints. So again, like that example, as if it's shrink wrapped or the most like simplest version of the sculpt. Not that much form contrast, relatively smooth, but still we get gesture, we get pose. Important things are established here. All right, so now we're gonna jump to the secondary forms. All right, so now we're getting more complicated if we jump back and forth. Now we're getting, there's more of them, right? And they're more complicated, they're more irregular, you know? Now all of a sudden we've got like this type of stuff going on. It's curvy, it's like some are small and some are big, right? So yeah, it's getting more complicated now, but you can see it's working on top of that primary form. You know, we're building on that structure and we're starting to add complexity. All right, so this is the secondary forms of this sculpt of a hand. And now if we jump to tertiary, all right, there we go. Now, I think another thing that's kind of important to realize is that the primary forms, lots going on. Obviously, you're starting from nothing. You're making these big movements. Things are big, right? Secondary forms, you're adding complexity, you're adding more quantity, but the things that you are doing, it's not moving the mesh as far, as big. And then tertiary forms, it's like it barely even breaks the silhouette if we jump back and forth, right? So this is very superficial. Tertiary detail is very superficial. It's on the surface. It helps convey material properties. In this case, you know, skin bending and skin as a material in itself. So that is how we break down this hand into these 3 categories. All right, so let's jump over to a head and see the same thing. Okay, so now here's this model and we'll take a look at breaking this down into the 3 categories. So this is what you could consider the primary forms of this head sculpt, okay? The teeth, super important in this one, so here you go, it's still separated out. But you can see like I don't have eye definition, I don't have the ear definition, but when I'm thinking about primary forms as I'm sculpting them, as I'm making the mesh, as I'm manipulating the base mesh, this is kind of how I'm thinking of it. Because still, what are we getting? Like, what are we thinking about when we're working on this? Like the ears, like the angle, you know, like when it starts to bend, like where the, like what the angle of the jaw is, where the nose is, and like this expression, how big the mouth is, like where the lips are, and then the interior of the mouth, like the bottom side of the nose, what's that look like? Where are the eyes? You know, that type of thing. The proportion, like how long the neck is, like what the base measures. So these are all important things that I'm figuring out, that I'm working on, that I'm thinking about in the early stages of a work. And these are all the primary form things. I don't need to concern myself with things like, you know, the inside of a nostril or the ear or something, because I can add that on afterwards. That follows this. So let's do that. Let's jump to the secondary forms. So now a lot more is going on, right? But again, the amount of form difference isn't that much. We can see these big forms, then they're getting a little bit more going on, right? Getting a little bit more complicated. You're spending a lot of time in the secondary forms, you know, trying to get all these like little angles right, you know, like this little contrast here, this type of like brow furrow, and, you know, where the eyelid line is, the size of the eyelids. And it's an important step. But it does follow suit from the primary step. So secondary forms. Now let's take a look at tertiary forms. Boom. I did visualize her jewelry. It's kind of a weird example, but I just wanted to like put it in there that, again, I was thinking about size and position, you know, detail, is trivial and it comes in at the end. I'm not sculpting something like a blurry jewelry, obviously, and adding detail like you would if you're doing like marble or something. But this helps visualize that mode of thinking, that detail is going to follow suit, but the most important thing is the size and position of the thing in the sculpt. And then tertiary detail, obviously starting to add all the little lines, the scrunchy nose, the lines on the lips, the hair, getting a little bit of suggested hair in there, some eyebrow hairs, the skin compressing. So, we're getting like some little compression lines here. We're getting these thin lines here. So this is that tertiary detail. Even the little earring has like these little like diamondy cuts. Okay, so how does this apply to sculpting in ZBrush in particular? So this helps in all kinds of sculpting. Obviously, I'm thinking about this sort of thing as I work. And throughout the process, like in the beginning stages, I'm starting with primitives, I'm pushing and pulling, and I'm really focusing on those primary forms to establish something that I can build off of. So I'm starting simple and large and getting more complicated as time goes on. Now I'm also kind of jumping up and down in ZBrush as I'm working with these subdivision levels. So if we go to the head, for instance, we can drop down. You see it has 6 subdivision levels here at the top. And if I drop down to something very low, you'll see I'm actually incapable of adding details. So this is a way for me to restrict myself to primary forms, or in that general neighborhood at least. So you can see the way I arrange my UI even is to start with Dynamesh, which is what I use to make meshes and do loose sculpting like a digital clay that's very rough. So that would be my primary forms, the start of my projects. I use ZRemesher next to make a base mesh, and you see as the base mesh I made for this one, I try to make it as low as possible, that then I can divide up, and as I divide up, I start to add more detail. So actually my workflow in ZBrush is trying to stay on track with that general progression of going from big to small, and I'm limiting myself with topology so that I'm kind of forcing myself to refine the sculpture and the forms without too much extra topology. And if at any time I want to change proportions, I just drop down and I start to like move things around. Then I can make these big general changes. So maybe the first couple are for primary forms, the second 2 for secondary, and the last for tertiary. And that's just general. That's not like an actual rule, but definitely, the last few subdivisions are there purely for doing tertiary forms, when it's high enough where you can actually just draw stuff on the sculpt, which you can't do as I drop down. Now we're in secondary forms land. So that's how I use ZBrush to help control this, stay on track. And obviously I'm thinking about this sort of thing just throughout as I make anything. Okay, cool. So there's a couple recent sculpts and how this would apply to my sculpts. Okay, now I want to break down some other work, right? Some work that's not mine and that's much better because I really want to hammer the point home here that primary, secondary, tertiary, this 1, 2, 3 is a way also of establishing the hierarchy of importance. I think one of the greatest examples of this is Masterworks in marble, because obviously with that medium, you're not doing skin pores, you're not doing hairs. So the amount of tertiary detail is extremely low, and they're doing a lot with primary and secondary. And obviously they're masters. So let's take a look at some Masterworks right now. All right, so first guy up, obviously David from Michelangelo, the legend. I picked this for a bunch of reasons. It's a great piece. I love it, and everyone knows it, right? So I think this is a great first thing to break down here. Now, looking at it after what we just said, is there a lot of tertiary detail? No. If I were to, guess or single out some things, the line around the eyes is interesting. Them even doing the highlight in the eye, which is cool. There's even a little bit of a thin line on the lips. Interesting, again, the neck wrinkle. Look at that. And then a couple wrinkles here. And then obviously the hair has a little bit of pizzazz, But again, very in this case, they have to be very subjective with the hair because they're limited with their medium. So those are some things that I might consider. Here's some other things, like there's some little wrinkles on the knuckles. Cool. I like that. There's a little extra line around the thumb, which is cool. And then some wrinkles here. You can see if you look closely, there's some fine lines here. So that's pretty cool. And I would argue the reason why those are there are for that realism, for that believability. Even though it's marble, they can't make marble look exactly like flesh, but just like the veins are doing, these little lines are helping the illusion that this stone is someone's hand. So I think these were creative choices made. They're obviously very fine lines, and these fine lines aren't everywhere, but they're in these key spots, and they are helping convey this believable person. Okay. And then we have obviously the primary and secondary forms. That would be what I think of obviously as proportion and as the pose. And so this is this first, example of contrapposity. They say this standing on one leg, which was considered extremely natural and revolutionary at the time, that like a statue would stand naturally. His hand very naturally relaxed, even though it's holding something. Great to study these. Please do. If you're new to these concepts of form hierarchy, I think through that lens, you can look at all kinds of other work and anything really. Try to, as an exercise, break those things down, and you can really separate out those kinds of forms and shapes, and you can better kind of understand what the artist might have been doing or what they were thinking, and that would help you in your own work too. Okay, so let's move on from Michelangelo here, and we're going to go to, boom, the legend. The Rape of Persephone by Bernini. So this is probably the most epic marble sculpture of all time. I think every sculptor loves this. And we're going to briefly talk a little bit why. We're just going to do a tiny bit of art history right here, okay? Tiny bit. Stay with me. But I think this helps in understanding form and sculpture. Permit me to be a little bit nerdy right here, but we're going to talk about it. So, Rape of Persephone, let's really quick do a little breakdown of this image here. This is the most famous part of this sculpture. And what I love about this is that it's, effing rad and not a lot of tertiary detail here. Maybe this type of stuff, maybe. But dude, really not much going on. I mean, those little lines we saw before, not there. A lot of just legendary primary and secondary forms. And so without much detail at all, we're seeing a level of naturalism with the compression of flesh and the contortion of the bodies in a way that people had never seen before in marble. This guy, Bernini, and these sculpts changed the game. Really, it seems like it topped out, honestly. When you look at art history, he crushed it. He was the Michael Jordan of sculpting in marble. He came after Michelangelo. And I think just growing up in a world that Michelangelo paved the way, this guy just took it to another level. Before we get into it, let's look at his David. Okay, we just looked at Michelangelo's David. This is Bernini's David. So some things that are different that we can see immediately here is that David is depicted much younger here. Also, not as Herculean, not as buff. This guy's not as buff. He's a little bit slight. Obviously still athletic, but younger looking and more like a guy of that time probably, right? He actually has the slingshot with the rock here, about to pwn Goliath.
Headshot.
And in Michelangelo's, he had the sling over his shoulder. He had the rock kind of in his hand a little bit, Again, not a lot of detail in this one. Overall, a lot more dynamic, right? And so what are the differences here? It's a lot more, quote unquote, realistic. It's a lot more naturalistic, because this is like what David would look like. That's what's exciting about this. And what's the big difference in the face? Let's take a closer look. The face. A lot more detail? No, not a lot more detail. So why was this considered a masterpiece also? Why do people think this is moving the bar maybe? This artist specifically made David because Michelangelo's David was famous. It was instantly regarded as a masterpiece. It still is a masterpiece. Obviously, both of these are. But he took his take on it. This is Bernini's take on the same subject. And what you get is a lot more dynamic action pose in the moment of the famous encounter, depicting a model that could look a lot more like maybe what he looked like, which is exciting, right, to viewers. And then what is his face doing? His face has an emotion. If we compare it to Michelangelo's, look at this emotion. He's eyeballing Goliath. He's about to throw this rock. And there's not more detail. There's not more forms. It's the choices. Okay, and I think that's an important thing and why I wanted to talk about it. So we have a little bit of stuff here. Again, very subtle secondary form type stuff. Not a lot of little tertiary things. Obviously, both of these time is a factor. Who knows what it looked like at the time? I just think it's really cool to look at it from a sculptor's point of view, from a form's point of view, without detail at all. What made this exciting? What progressed sculpture? In The Rape of Persephone and in this, David, what we have is an expression of emotion with a limited amount of forms. And I think that's awesome. I think that's inspiring, and that's something that I wanted to share for sculptors out there. These trends, by the way, are still going on today, right? That what's exciting about seeing movies, like when you go see a Christopher Nolan movie or a new movie out here, is like you want to feel that it's real. You want the characters to be more believable. You want the backdrops and the setting to feel more believable. You want that emotion to be more rich. And here we're seeing it in sculptures hundreds of years ago, that an artist is trying to make it feel more like David and make the viewer feel more like they're seeing someone alive, but in marble. So what can form hierarchy do for you? It can help you organize chaos a little bit, help you take things that are complicated and make them a little bit simpler. It can help you organize your sculpture and your work, your thinking as you work on something and as you break something down to help figure out, how to recreate something, or maybe how an artist made it themselves. So practice primary and secondary forms. The better you get at them, the better all your work will be. And don't neglect how much you can do with primary forms. The age, the proportion, the pose, the idea, the story. If at all possible, to add more emotion and meaning into something that you do, then the better. So keep it on, make some cool shit, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thank you for watching.